So on Monday, we talked about how to improve a vertical jump for someone with a narrow infrasternal angle. Now let's talk about the wide infrasternal angles. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Well, happy Wednesday. It is Wednesday. That means that tomorrow is Thursday, which means 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thursday morning. The Coffee and Coaches conference call will take place as usual prior to my leaving on vacation. Also, a quick reminder, today at 1 p.m. for those of you that are members of iFast University, you have a call at 1 p.m. Eastern Time with the one Mike Robertson. So don't forget about that. Okay, so time is always short on Wednesdays, as you know. So we're going to dig into today's Q&A, which we talked about narrow ISAs and vertical jump on Monday, and I didn't realize that there was going to be a bit of an uproar in the Q&A email, but I got a slew of people that came through and they said, well, what about the wide ISAs? It's like I seem to have offended people by not talking about the wides, so we're going to talk about wides today. There's going to be a little bit of a problems list like we had with the narrows. A little bit more on the extreme opposite end, but we're going to see some similarities too, because we're still dealing with tissue behaviors. We're still just dealing with time constraints. So when we talk about the difference between the narrow and the wides, when we talked about the narrows, we're talking about they want to descend too far in their counter movement before a vertical jump, and so we would need to address measures to control that. Whereas with the wide ASAs, because of the concentric orientation of the pelvic outlet, because of the concentric orientation of the extremities, we have a totally different situation here where they actually lack the downward movement within their technique of the counter movement. And so we get things that we refer to as back jumpers, where as they try to make their descent, they still need to go down, they still need to produce force in the ground, they still need to somehow capture some form of yielding action. But you'll see that the pelvis actually stops moving, and then you see this forward bend action during the vertical jump. And they can still jump. I mean, there's still people that jump very, very high using this technique, but if we want to try to improve it, then we want to try to get a better descent in this pelvic outlet. So we need to capture a little bit more motion so we have more time to create the yielding action. And so that's going to be our step number one. Again, let's go back to the tissue behaviors. The second thing we have to think about is like they just don't have a yielding action available to them. So the degree of the exhalation bias, concentric orientation, and then if we superimposed any prolonged amount of heavy strength training on top of this, we have increased tissue stiffness. So the tissue behavior is biased towards an overcoming action. And so that tissue is much more difficult to deform, and so we don't get the yielding action that we want there. Especially when we talk about the internal mechanics, we want to make sure that we can get the guts to push down on that pelvic outlet and create sort of this trampolining of these internal forces. But because the internal pressures in a wide infrasternal angle tends to be very, very high and very, very consistent, we don't have any gradient, and so the guts just tend to sit on top of that pelvic outlet and keep it continuously loaded. So again, we have a tissue stiffness problem. And then number three would be the time constraint. Like I mentioned before, it's like we need enough time in the counter movement to load and create the yielding action, and then create the release of that yielding action, which is the release of energy that allows us to jump. So if we go into strategies, and we say strategy number one, we need to gain enough eccentric orientation of the outlet to acquire some distance in the counter movement. So I'm going to mention this. I love the box squat for this circumstance. So whereas in the narrow we're using the box to control the descent of the outlet, we're going to actually use the same strategy here with a different purpose. So what we're going to do is we're going to progressively lower the height of the box so we can acquire this necessary descent in the counter movement. And we're going to make sure that we deload onto the box. So deloading onto the box distributes the load through the entire axial skeleton in the connective tissues, which is going to produce this yielding action. So we get this sort of expansion at the bottom, and then this recoil that propels us up off the box. So we start to train the descent of the outlet, and so we're just going to progressively lower that box height. Strategy number 2. We want to increase the yielding action of the connective tissue. So we don't even have to leave the box squat just yet. So what we're going to do here is where we use the reverse band to slow the descent of the guts in the narrow ISA situation. What we want to do now is we want to accelerate them. So we need to create a gradient internally that allows the guts to travel downward at a faster rate. So when it does hit the pelvic outlet, we have enough force to produce the yielding action in the connective tissues internally. And so again, we're going to use the banded squat under these circumstances. So what you want to understand here is that we're actually increasing the time of the load. So the duration that the load initiates to the end of the loading actually increases internally. And so what we get is this expansion of the connective tissue. So this is the yielding action that I talk about. Whereas if we did something that was really, really heavy, and we have this instantaneous load internally where we maintain maximum pressure throughout the lift. Now we don't have this pressure gradient, we don't have any duration of loading, and that's instantaneous, and that's what makes the tissue stiffer. This is why maximal strength training can actually become interference when we're trying to create an increase in vertical jump, which requires this yielding action. So strategy number 3 then was we want to progressively increase our ability to yield through the tissues. So this is where we're going to start to do some box landing. So where we with the narrow ISA, we were using the seated box jump to control the outlet and produce this concentric orientation in the vertical jump. In this case, what we want to do is, again, we want to extend the duration that these tissues are loaded, and we can do that through these box landings. Now, it doesn't need to be the maximal extreme. In fact, we know exactly how high the box should be based on your landing, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to have a landing that necessarily exceeds the position that you would use to produce your ideal counter movement, because anything lower than that is just an increase in time that could dampen some of the forces. So again, you're going to have to control the depth of those jumps based on what you would consider the ideal position in the counter movement, which you discover over time through practice and monitoring. Our strategy number 4 now is we got to think about the timing. So we have the same issue with the narrow ISAs where we have a timing issue as to how long we're going to allow this counter movement to occur. We need a yielding action within the shortest amount of time frame that gives us the best return on investment. So this is where we're going to start to use repeat jumps, and we're going to start with lower amplitude because we have to precondition the body for this. And so the lower amplitude allows us to get repeat exposures. So it's almost like if you had to blow up a balloon, you're going to stretch the balloon a little bit first. And so we're going to teach the connective tissues to store and release, store and release, store and release. And then what we do is we slowly expand the duration of that loading through the repeated jumps. And so we might use something like like an oscillatory squat like we did with the narrows. We can do that. This will eventually become something that might look like a jump squat. But the point is we're only limited by our creativity under these circumstances. But the idea is to slowly increase the amplitude of these jumps. So we start with low hurdles. What we may end up with is something that is a much higher hurdle that we're trying to clear under those circumstances. If you've spent any time on the internet looking at jumping activities, you've probably come across Werner Gunther's old videos. So he was a shot putter and does some amazing plyometric activities, which they're just fun to watch, but it's just a representation of what is possible. It's not something that we would start with. We need to, again, precondition these people towards these activities, and eventually what we can do is maybe we can restore some of that yielding action and improve the vertical jump. So for all of you folks out there that were interested in the wide ISA vertical jump strategies, I hope this was helpful. If not, then just feel free to ask me a question at askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys tomorrow morning at the Coffee and Coaches Conference Call, 6 a.m. Thursday.